All right. Thanks, Tom. Today we're going to go into Love's Top 10 list. And there's a lot of things that are tens in the Bible. And two things in this same vein that deal with the number 10 are the 10 plagues, which is always a joy to share, and then the 10 commandments, or as Josephine calls them, the 10 suggestions. Just kidding. So Love's Top 10 list. When something bad happens, people usually ask the question, why did God allow this to happen? If you've seen a horrendous thing, a tsunami, a flood, a shooting, and the short answer is, he didn't. God is only good and the devil is only bad. God is only love and the devil is only hate. God is only light and the devil is only darkness, and they don't cross. Love is really simple, but evil's really easy. And today I want to show you God's deliverance is, I want to show you how God's deliverance is what should be highlighted when we talk about the 10 plagues and not the devastation. So this may be a little different angle, and it will be than if you watch the movie every spring. See, love is always on the top 10 list. So why did the Egyptians enslave the Israelites? So we have to do a running start. Why did all this happen? Why were they put into slavery at one time anyway? And see, so starting off, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers who were jealous of him. And he ended up in Egypt. He got thrown in prison, kept his head together, and when he was released from prison, he showed such great wisdom that the Pharaoh made him second in charge in Egypt. I mean, he was second in command of the world power. And Joseph was totally trusted by the Pharaoh, and he designed a plan to keep his relatives safe, which we'll call the children of Israel. And so now we're going to go into something here called the children of the children of the children of Israel. See, he wanted to figure out how to keep them safe, healthy, and prospering in a foreign land. Now, birth rates today are closely monitored in this volatile world, and they always have been, actually. And our CIA watches the birth rate of all countries because somehow, directly or indirectly, it affects our country. And for example, most modern countries in the Western Hemisphere have a very low birth rate, while most of what we would call enemy countries have very high rates of birth. And this alarms the CIA. To drop below having 2.1 children per woman birth rate will shrink a population below 20% in 4 generations. And most of just to sustain a population, a woman has to have, every woman has to have at least 2 children just to sustain. Some women don't have kids, and some women have more, of course, and some women don't have any. And so they figured it takes 2.07 or 2.1 children per woman for it to work. And most of our Middle Eastern and African brothers have between 4 and 7 children per woman. And many of these people are relocating into the West. And this shifts the political and religious structure of our entire planet. And any shift of population or religion causes governmental concern. This was happening at the time of the children of Israel in Egypt. Why the mass exodus? And we've all heard of the story of Israel's exodus from Egypt, and you might have seen the video they took called the 10 Commandments, and they originally went there to buy grain because of this huge famine that was wiping out the Middle East. And God had someone in a position of power there who was related to them, actually saved them. Poor treatment. Now, little do we hear what I'm about to share with you of how poorly the Egyptians treated their own countrymen at this time. Before the children of Israel were mistreated, Egypt mistreated its own people. And this is going to help us understand the incredible hatred that they had for Israel before Exodus. And if you want to turn to Genesis 47, you can, but I'm going to do a quick synopsis here. And in verse 14, a great famine hit. Joseph commanded all the money of the Egyptians to be confiscated. Think IRS. And all the wealth of Egypt was put into Pharaoh's treasury. And they were given grain in return, but this soon ran out. Verse 16 says, next the Egyptian people got hungry. They traded in all their cattle for more grain so they could live. And when the grain ran out this time, they feared for their lives. Now all the Egyptians had no more money and no more livestock. The whole country didn't, except for royalty. And all they had was land. And so Joseph had them trade their land in for food. So they handed the deeds of their land over to Joseph, who handed them to the Pharaoh. And now they were no longer homeowners or landowners. And the government owned almost all the land at this point. In verse 21, Joseph now moved the Egyptians all off their recently forfeited land, think eminent domain, and spread them around Egypt. And he gave them work for food. Or work and food, excuse me. And the only problem now was they had to work for the government. They were totally government dependent. And this was for Joseph and Pharaoh. And they were no longer homeowners. They were no longer landowners. And they were totally dependent on the government of Egypt for their welfare. And that's not a good place to be. Verse 23, Joseph gave them seed so they could grow crops and feed themselves. The only catch is now they lived on land that belonged to the Pharaoh. And they were moved to different areas of Egypt. So they uprooted families and they scattered them all over Egypt. And then whatever they grew, they had to give back a fifth to Pharaoh. That's 20% tax. And who ever heard of such a thing, of paying actually 20% tax? But they had full stomachs but empty bank accounts. And I was thinking how today we pay much more in taxes, but we complain less. Verse 25, the Egyptians were so poor and their believing had dropped so low that now they actually sold themselves and their children into slavery just to survive. You think about some of these people during World War II, what some of the women in Europe did just to live. They prostituted themselves, and I mean, it's horrible what people have to do sometimes. People today are selling their children for money in different places in Southeast Asia. It's crazy. But they sold themselves into slavery. They literally sold themselves to the government of Pharaoh so they could live. They just gave up. Verse 22 through 26 those two verses, it's interesting to note that Joseph didn't take any of the land that belonged to the Egyptian priests. They got to keep their land. And this shows the firmly upheld religious structure of the Egyptians. Now, this will come into play later. Their gods were huge. And even the Pharaoh, who himself was considered a god, would not mess with the priests. Even kings don't want a negative shift in the emotional poles. And verse 27, here's the kicker. The children of Israel who were foreigners, living in Egypt, they were treated better than the Egyptians. And unlike the Egyptians, the Hebrew people were reproducing rapidly. And the Egyptians were in population decline at that time. And this didn't go unnoticed, and it caused terrible resentment. Still does today. You see people immigrating into a country and populating quickly, and it really raises the eyes of different people. How do you think the enslaved Egyptians view those freeloading children of Israel? Why don't they go back to where they came from? Go back over the border. You think there was some lousy talk around the water cooler in between slavery duties? Do you think there was hatred or jealousy or envy? Oh, yeah. You think they wanted what Joseph's kinfolks had? Oh, yeah. Yeah, class envy. See, everyone in Egypt was a slave now except the royalty, the priests, and the Israelites. And this was good for the Hebrew people, but bad for everyone else. Something was about to give. And here's a quote from someone who understood revolution. I began revolution with 82 men. If I had to do it again, I'd do it with 10 or 15 and absolute faith. It does not matter how small you are if you have faith and a plan of action. Fidel Castro. He knew revolution. You see, now think about what these people, these slaves were plotting and what they were dreaming. What were they talking to their priests about? Aren't priests the go-to people of a society? The ministers, the men and women of God, of the holy people? They're the people go to. And they were protected. The revolution of love. See, every revolution starts with hatred for a class of people who've affected them adversely, either true or assumed. And Israel was doing nothing to affect the Egyptians other than they prospered and the Egyptians didn't. B.C. Forbes said, jealousy is a mental cancer. Exodus chapter 1. Go ahead and turn there. And we're going to start in verse 5. Exodus 1 and in verse 5. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls. That sounds neat. His offspring and progeny and such, 70 people. For Joseph was in Egypt already. Joseph is the guy we're talking about who did some of these things to Egypt to keep Egypt afloat during a great famine. He did what he had to do to help the Pharaoh, but it enslaved the entire population. Verse 6, and Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation, and the children of Israel were fruitful. Now look at these words here. They were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. See, this verse tells us how fast the children of Israel multiplied. Verse 5 says they started off with about 70 people, and they were in Egypt for maybe 215 years, and not all of that slave time. I wasn't able to totally figure that one out. And so if you think about 215 years, what's happened in the last 215 years in the United States? 215 years ago was in the late 1700s. We were still going through a revolution. Look how our country's changed. So it's a long time. Verse 7 says, fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and filled the land. And that may be God's subtle little way of telling us something about how many kids these people were having. I mean, there was some shaking going on, And don't turn there, but Exodus 12, 37, 38 tells us that eventually 600 men plus women and children left Egypt. So from 70 to 600,000 plus men and women, that's a lot of you-know-what. And there must have been a lot of dancing going on in that area. And did you know that some of the people who left Egypt with the Israelites were not of the bloodline of Israel? And you can see that they were a mixed bag of races who was also slaves, and they left with the children of Israel. So pretty wild. So they're part of that 600,000. So because researchers, they go nuts with that number. No way it could happen. They just can't. Millions of people, they can't figure it out. But it wasn't just them. But the people who left with them had to go along with the religion that they were promulgating and moving and beginning to re-believe in. Because remember, these people, Hebrew people, had sort of forgotten. I mean, they've been in another country for hundreds of years. I knew a guy from, he came and talked, one time here at True North, and he said his family, he's from Iran, and they got him out of there because they would have got killed because they're Christians. His family's Christian. But he said that his parents are sort of mixed between Muslim and Christian, so they can survive there. Because I don't know what it's like to have, death threats. And so if you play both ways, it might be easier to live. Well, see, the Hebrews had to have played both sides. That's where these plagues are going to come in. They would have fully understood what each one of these plagues meant and which Egyptian god would have caused them. And it was sort of in your face. And we'll see that in a few minutes here. And we're going to, we all understand the term fruitful. That means they had a bunch of kids. But the words increased abundantly in verse 7 means to swarm like fish or insects. The Hebrew people were populating so quickly, they were breeding like a swarm of insects. That's what it means. That's what God's saying here. And to wax exceedingly mighty means, the word mighty is the same word as exceeding, and it means to increase exceeding. Or to grow mighty. It's mighty. They were having some mighty growth going on there. And it was cause for alarm for this country of Egypt. Look how our politicians today bend to the dominant minority. It's always happened. It always will happen. You saw when Jesus Christ was going through his passion, his drama towards the end of his life, and how the political Roman leaders bent to the people that served them, the children of Israel. There's a distinguished French historian, historian of immigration. His name is Gerard Nouriel, and he says that 1/3 of the population living in France is of foreign descent now. 1/3. According to the CIA World Fact Book, not Facebook, the numbers on French religions as of 2000 are Roman Catholics 83%, Protestant is 2%, Jewish 1%, Muslim 7%, and unaffiliated 4%. So, I mean, it's a high percentage of some of these groups here. See, 1/3 of the population of France is of foreign descent, and they're the ones having the children at the higher birth rate. France is concerned. Egypt was concerned because the Israelites were swarming and babies were just popping out. And they couldn't have babies as easy. They'd become a weaker society. You know, when you let everybody else do your work, you become weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. That's why we have gyms. You know? But I mean, it's just the fact of life. The civilizations that have to work the hardest usually have the most kids. A revolution of hate, verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Now that should say a lot. And the word new indicates new in a totally different way. He was from a different dynasty than the prior Pharaoh. There's a new sheriff in town. I'm going to change everything. And don't politicians, a lot of times they'll say that, they'll go against the platform of the other guy just to be, because they get good votes that way. Well, this guy wasn't much different. He became Pharaoh. He saw all of Egypt was slaves. And these people who aren't even genetically linked to us, they're prospering like crazy. In fact, there was more people who were Israelites than there were Egyptians. Would that be scary? Oh, yeah. Because they didn't think of themselves as Egyptians, even though they lived there for so long. That's why most countries you have to be from that country to be a president or take a high office, because it's real easy to be, to lean toward the country of your birth. And so, see, he wanted to stamp out the plague, this plague of God's people once and for all. I want to get rid of them. Got to put them in their place. Verse 9, and he said to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. That's frightening. They're more and mightier than we. Mighty. They were mighty. Come, verse 10. Come on, let's deal wisely with them. Let's figure this out. Let's get out our white, dry erase boards. Let's get our computer programs, going. Get all the extrapolations of numbers working here. How do we get this thing turned back around? Well, he's going to do it the fast way. There's other ways he could have done it, but he's going to do it the fast way. And he said, let's deal wisely with them, lest when they multiply even more, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and they fight against us, and so we get them up out of our land. See, they held a lot of the wealth of Egypt. Remember, they prospered. They multiplied. If they were the same size as the Egyptian people, who most of them were slaves, who had the wealth? They did, and the priests and the government. That's it. Now you know why when they left and they demanded, because we're going to see how they became slaves, and they demanded the jewels of the women of Egypt. They were just getting back what was theirs. Does this make a little more sense now? And the Pharaoh saw something was amiss in his realm. Something's amiss in the realm. And the Egyptians were slaves in their own country, and the non-Egyptians, the children of Israel, were populating and prospering like crazy. This didn't make sense to Pharaoh, and it didn't make sense to the Egyptians. Everybody was unhappy except the children of Israel. New to slavery. This new Pharaoh was very nationalistic, and he attacked the Israelites viciously. He took all their property, he took all their prosperity, and he forced them into hard slavery. Imagine losing everything. Think about the concentration camps. Of course, it wasn't that bad. But, I mean, they lost everything. You know, those people. These people lost everything. Everything was taken from them. Now the tides turn. Now they're the slaves. And it doesn't say it, but the children of Egypt were set free. And some kind of a wealth distribution had to go on there. And these Hebrew slaves were made to build 2 cities just for the purpose of holding treasure. And this may have been to hold some of the treasure that was taken from them. Imagine that. Imagine building these huge cities to hold treasure that was yours, to keep it from you. And because our treasure now is electronic. You know, I mean, you don't want to know how much is in your bank, you can find out online. You know, money doesn't mean the same thing. Then you had treasure, you had treasure. You had gold, you had gold. You had jewels, you had jewels. Not so today. You have little certificates of paper that some people still carry, right? And you know, it's interesting to note that the harsher the people of the lineage of Israel were treated, the more kids they had. And to stop this population explosion, this new Pharaoh commanded that the midwives kill all the male children the moment they were born. Now that's population control. You know, I mean, here's some amazing ladies. The only Hebrew people mentioned by name in the Bible between the death of Joseph and the naming of Moses, which is maybe around 200 years, were 2 Hebrew midwives called Shipporah and Puah. And they defied the king and they saved the boys. Let's hear it for the boys. And see, they had to be amazing ladies to stand up face to face. They had a face-to-face meeting with the Pharaoh, and he says, "Why are you not killing the boys?" And so they said, "Because the Hebrew women aren't weak like the Egyptian women. By the time we get there, all there is the afterbirth to deliver." So he scratched his bald head, you know, and see, and the wild thing is, in that period of time, no man rose up. There isn't a single man of note of the Hebrew people at that point. Moses was the first one. Now, if you read more about Moses' mom and sister, they were pretty cool too, but they also weren't named at this point. They're named later. Jochebed and Miriam, you know, but, you know, ask and ye shall receive. You know, like the Egyptians, now Israel's believing and sunk to an all-time low, and they were the slaves. You know, John 16:24 says, ask and ye shall receive. Exodus 2:23. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up to God by reason of bondage. And God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. See, these people had prospered in Egypt for many years, but now they were the slaves. And how long had it been since they called out to God? You know, God, you know, they were at a spiritual low. And I was thinking how God will still deliver us, no matter how bad the situation or how many mistakes we've made, if we ask. And all that we've been teaching lately, asking is a form of believing. Prayer is a form of believing. And when you believe, what happens? You receive. It works. So now they're getting their minds set. See, if God can deliver us during our worst of times, how much easier will it be for him to prosper us during our best of times? Keep asking. When the times are good, keep asking. Don't lose your spirituality and connection with God, so to speak. Your mental connection. See, James 4:2 says, ye lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. This was written to believers. Maybe like 27 AD, something like that. Ye fight and war, yet ye have not because ye ask not. We beat all around the bush. We kill, we make wars, we do all this to get the things that we want when all we had to do is ask God. Pretty simple. Oh, the nature of man. We fight, we go to war, we kill each other to get what we want when all we had to do is ask. This is a big lesson here. Ask and you too will receive. Now the beginning of the end. Now you see what led up to the enslavement of the children of Israel. God prospered them like crazy for many years, so much so that they began to overpopulate or outpopulate the Egyptians. And the leader who loved and protected them, Joseph, he died. And the new king was afraid of Israel and enslaved them. Fear always opens the door to calamity. Somebody's. Proverbs 29:25 says, the fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in the Lord shall be safe. And we too are going to be safe as we put our trust in the Lord. It always starts with one. Moses was born during the time of this new Pharaoh, when he demanded that all males get terminated at birth, population control. And his mom hid him for 3 months and realized that she too was about to be ratted out. So she built this mini ark and put him inside and set him down in a special place in the Nile. But don't tell anybody. And this was where the royalty bathed. They didn't just float it down the Nile on the back of a crocodile. And Exodus 2, verse 2, it says, and the woman conceived and bare a son, and she saw him that he was a goodly child, probably by revelation, and she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and he laid in the flags or the reeds by the river's bank. Did you know that Moses is his Egyptian name? It's not his Hebrew name. Anybody know what his Hebrew name was? Only God does. Isn't that wild? It's never put in the Bible. Moses just means water saved or drawn out of the water. So that's not even a Hebrew name, Moses. God knows what his name was. And God even knows the names your parents didn't name you. My mom told me one time that if I had been born a girl, that my name would have been Sandy, because she loved the name Sandy. And when I was 5, she married a widower, and he had 4 kids, and one of the girls' names was Sandy. So my mom got her Sandy, which is sort of cool. So I know what my name would have been had I been a girl. Then it would have been 2 in 1 family, I guess. So that would have been awkward. In Exodus 2:5, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, the reeds, she sent her maid to fetch it. Saw this thing look like a little boat, floating stuck in the reeds, and she said, "Go fetch it." She's royalty; she can do what she wants. So she had her little slave girl go and fetch this thing, and then it says, and when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she opened it, and I just got a weird mind picture. I thought of like, she saw Noah, a mini Noah, and all these mini animals Noah. It says ark there. And she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And that's when the baby started crying. this baby Moses, or it was unnamed to her, and she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." You know, his tears signaled the beginning of the end for the power of the Egyptian gods over Israel. And I was also thinking about how his mom, how Moses' mom probably scoped this out in the 3 months. And she knew, I mean, to put him right there where the royalty bathes, and she might have known that this girl had a big heart. You could see how she treated her servants. So she probably knew she had a compassionate heart. There's a lot of places she could have floated that thing. Sort of weird how the devil's always trying to kill off the Christ line. You know, you think it's crazy how this has happened time and time over the centuries. Verse 11, and it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, he went out to his brethren, looked on their burdens, he spied out an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren, and he looked this way and that way, just like you might if you were about to do some nefarious deed, you know, and he killed the Egyptian. He slew him and hid him in the sand. Now, was this right according to Egyptian law? No. Even though royalty could, but it couldn't have been right, because later on it talks about that he fled from the face of Pharaoh. If you read verse 15, when the Pharaoh heard it, you know, he wanted to kill Moses for doing this. So maybe his adopted dad didn't like him as much as his adopted mom. Now, did Moses look different than the children of Israel? Yes. In Egypt, it was a disgrace to have a beard. The Hebrews, it was a disgrace for men not to have one. So it was immediate, you could tell the difference. If a man had a beard, he was Hebrew in that area. If he didn't, he was Egyptian. So he splits. And he goes, we read this last week, but I got to read it again because I've learned something more on this. And it says, verse 15, and the Pharaoh heard this thing, and he sought to slay Moses. Moses fled from the face of the Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, about 300 miles to the southeast. And he sat down by a well. This well had a trough near it. And now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds, other shepherds, came and drove them away. Get out of here, you women, get out of here. And forced them away. And Moses stood up and helped them. So Moses now fought these guys off. These shepherds ran them off, however he did it. And then he drew the water out and took care of these 7 ladies and their flock, however big that flock was. And Moses was running away from Pharaoh. He ran away from the Pharaoh, his adopted dad, and then he's going to be brought into this wonderful family. He stood up for and helped these 7 sheep herding sisters, the daughters of the priest of Midian. And this man performed duties similar to Melchizedek, Shem, and Job. And he was the go-to guy spiritually in that land. Verse 18, and when they came to Reuel their father, I thought his name was Jethro. When they came to Reuel their father, he said, how is it that you come so soon today? And now Reuel is Jethro. But here's a cool tidbit I thought about this morning. The name Reuel means a friend of God. Is it a name or is it a title? And who else in the Bible was called a friend of God? Abraham. Abraham was. Reuel, or Reuel, I guess would be a better way to say it, Reuel or Jethro's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather had the same nickname or title, Abraham. Now the children of Israel, through their genetic, through one mother, through, was it Sarah? They're all the children of Israel that were enslaved in Egypt. Through Keturah, the slave of Sarah, there was a whole nother genetic line that were still trained by the same dad. We think of this about the son of, Ishmael, that he was such a bad guy. But you think about it, for this Ruel or Jethro to be such a great guy, there had to be the same training that went along this other line. Into the Arabian Peninsula. This further tells us that Jethro was a true prophet of God, like Abraham. That's what God's trying to show you here. He was like Abraham. And Moses isn't going to turn out too bad himself. And verse 19, and they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. Now, why did they call him an Egyptian? Because he didn't have what? A beard. And probably he had Egyptian clothes on. They dressed different. Egyptians were meticulously neat and clean. I mean, they wore white linen. I mean, they were being dirty was totally bad. When I lived in Japan in the 60s, if a Japanese man had a tan, he would be considered a lower class, because that means he actually worked with his hands. He worked outside. That's why the geisha girls all powder themselves up all white. And the businessmen, it was sort of creepy. They had one long fingernail, and it wasn't for cocaine. It was to show that they didn't work with their hands. So they kept one fingernail long to show everyone that they actually had an office job. When I worked at Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in Hoboken, New Jersey, as a machinist, which is right across from New York City, we had a guy from India that worked with us. He came to work every day in a suit and tie and a briefcase. And he was a machinist just like me. And he would put down he'd change clothes, put them in his locker, and then he'd change to his work clothes and do work all day, and he'd leave dressed like this. I wondered to this day if he told his wife that he was an executive there. Because in many cultures, to have an office job is much higher than having a physical job. Now, in our country, you can do pretty good with in the trades. But in most countries, you don't. So here he was, Egyptian, delivered us out of his hand. Then he asked to his daughters, where is he? Verse 20. And why'd you leave him behind? And bring him home for dinner. And Moses, went and he just stuck around. He just stayed there. Then this guy, this priest of Midian, gave him his daughter called Zipporah. And so I just think it's pretty cool. So he married this woman, had 2 kids with her, spent 40 years working for Jethro, and he's getting his head back. Getting his head back. After being inundated with the gods of Egypt, what do you think his schooling consisted of? Even in the United States, what was the whole educational system based on? Colleges. Religion. All colleges started off as biblical universities or seminaries. That's how colleges started in our country. The higher learning was to learn about the higher one, the highest God. Same thing back then. The colleges that he went to, that he was trained in, would have been to teach him about all the gods of Egypt. Remember, they didn't touch the priests. So now we're going to get to this all-important part of this teaching. I know it's taken a long build-up, but here it is. One day Moses saw this burning, talking bush, like we talked about last week. God told him to go back to Egypt and rescue the children of Israel. He says, okay. And he goes by himself. He picks up his stick and he goes. He's 80 years old. These 10 plagues that we're going to talk about, they happened in rather quick succession, about less than a year. It wasn't like days or hours, but it was over the course of a year, something like that. And these opened the door for the children of Israel to escape. The 10 plagues all surrounded a specific Egyptian god. And what I also noticed, that if you take the 10 commandments, 1 through 10, and then you reverse the order of these 10 plagues, starting with 10 and work down to 1, that they'll match up almost directly with the 10 commandments. The contrary wise is pretty interesting. The first plague was blood, and the Nile turned into blood. And see, the Nile, they worshiped the god of the Nile, and his name is Happy. It's Hapi or Hapy. Don't know what it is in hieroglyphics. And see, without the Nile, Egypt would just be a desert. There'd be nothing, but it would flood every year, and then it would put all this fertile soil onto the land, and then it would recede. The second it receded, the frogs began to croak. And the croaking frogs to the Egyptians meant it's time to plant another crop. So frogs, they worship frogs. It meant the water's receding. We're going to have abundance again this year. So the second plague was frogs. Now remember, don't think of God as doing these plagues. Think about how the enemy was trying to kill off, not just kill off everybody. The devil would be willing to kill off all his people if he can get to the people of God, because he is death. He doesn't care. He'll kill his own. There's even humans that will kill their own to get ahead. Think about kings and queens of old. Politicians do it, have done it. Nothing new. And so that's the second one. The third one's lice or gnats. I couldn't figure out which was which, but this is a god called Geb, and it's the god of the dust. And the fourth one was flies, and this is the lord of the flies, Kepler or Beelzebub. Would be one. But I mean, all these gods, you can also take them and see how they fit in with all the other religions' gods. Their main ones. So it's still happening today, folks. People still worship this stuff, but it has a different name. And then the fifth one was an animal plague. And the god associated with that was Hathor, and it's a god of love and protection. So they would have worshipped that. Then the sixth one was boils. And this is the goddess of healing. Could be, and there's a lot of names. I don't know which one. Isis, Imhotep, Sekhmet. I don't know. And then the seventh one was hail. And that was the goddess of the sky, or Nut, or Newt, N-U-T. And then the eighth one was locust. And that was and that's the god of the crops, which is Seth, or Set. And then the ninth one was darkness, and they would have worshipped the sun god, Ra. And then finally, the death of the firstborn goes back to Pharaoh worship, because they literally worship Pharaoh. Just like the Japanese worshiped the emperor, even during World War II. If you remember that, they worshiped the Pharaoh. They prayed to the Pharaoh. He was a god. And his child would be a god, the next god. And so you think about the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt have no gods before me, number one. And it matches up perfectly with Pharaoh worship. No graven images, the second one. Any likeness, the sun god Ra, the second one. And you can just go down the list, and it's really It's really wild how these fit together. I was thinking about these 10 commandments on how from 6 through 10, it talks about thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against a neighbor, thou shalt not covet. It's all thou shalt. And those are the ones that Jesus Christ said. Jesus Christ split them all into two. Love God, love your neighbor. And that's love your neighbor. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to murder him. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to commit adultery. You're not going to bear false witness against him. You're not going to covet what they have. I mean, Jesus was sharp. And then love God. You don't have any other gods before him. You don't take the name of God in vain. You don't make any other images of gods. You know, you keep the Sabbath here, according to this. I mean, it's pretty wild. You know, honor your father and mother. You know, I mean, that all relates back. It's a whole different side, but it relates back to that love God. So, again, you know, you reverse the order, you play with it a little bit, and you'll see how they all fit together. And it wasn't that God brought these 10 plagues to free Egypt. The devil was trying to kill everybody off. The great miracle of this isn't the plague, it's the deliverance from it. It's the water turning back to water. It's the frogs going back. It's the lice leaving, the flies. It's the healing, you know, from boils. Hail. It wasn't the Egyptians' land that the hail, it wasn't the Israelites' land. You know, they didn't get affected by this the same as the children of Egypt. You see, and then the locusts come. I read that a ton, 1 ton of locusts, which are grasshopper, can eat as much as 2,500 men. So when the locusts came, everything the hail didn't ruin, they ate. In other words, this country was wiped out this year. It was wiped out. And then the firstborns, you know, died. You know, at the very end. But I mean, it was dark, so dark they could feel it, and so it's wild stuff. And so the sun god who they worshipped, you know, then this darkness came. You know, I mean, it's crazy stuff. You know, he controlled the light, so to speak. So it's So, you know, these 10 commandments, or as my wife said, the 10 suggestions. I shouldn't say that. She didn't say that. It just makes it funny when you think about Josephine. You know, the point here is it seems like God is the one who sent these plagues to back off the enemy. That's at the movie show. That's what it sort of sounds like in King James, that we don't understand that what they didn't understand. They didn't understand, in fact, they didn't understand love. It never in the Old Testament says that God loves us. It tells us to love God. Or if it's in there, it's hidden in different ways. The New Testament, that's all it says. Jesus Christ opened all kinds of eyes to who God was and also who the enemy was. They didn't know. They would blame God for what, well, our insurance companies blame God for what the devil does. Still doing it. Yeah. If you follow that logic, you know, that God, if we follow the logic that God will do the same for us, if God, excuse me, let me get my thoughts here. It seems like God caused the plagues to back off the enemy. But if you follow that logic through, that means that if we blow it, what could happen to us? Bad stuff, right? So, but we know that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. You know, I was on a job the other day at a Jewish lady's house. And I was talking about God and stuff. I like to, you know, she likes to talk about this with me, this gal. And And I said that I talked to people from all different faiths over the years, and I see how God loves and cares for all of humanity. And I said, God is love. And then she said, God is love, period. End of story. She said, God, she said, I think God sees people a whole different way than we do. See, people know this stuff. It's amazing. See, the devil was willing to kill off the whole nation of Egypt in order to kill off the children of Israel, because in that group was going to be the bloodline of Jesus Christ. See, the devil, not God, sent the plagues. God, not the devil, not the gods of the Egyptians, delivered them. See, the miracle that helped the children of Israel believe to escape wasn't God sending a plague. The miracle was God's delivering them from the power of these other gods. See, God gave true freedom when he gave that love. Love is always on the top 10 list, and you are always on God's top 10 list. God bless.